Welcome to video 7 as we explore Genesis 17 and the covenant of circumcision that God enters into with Abraham and the promise that he makes of a child named Isaac. When we last saw Abraham, he was again in the midst of a mess of his own making by giving way to fear instead of holding on to faith. Abraham had chosen to listen to his wife Sarah and impregnate her maidservant Hagar in order to bring about by human means the son that they needed to carry on their family line. But God is gracious, and Hagar produces a son for Abraham at 86 years old. But this son, Ishmael, is not the son that God promised to Abraham. When we next encounter Abraham, he's 99 years old, and so 13 years have passed when we pick up the story. In Genesis 17 and verse 1, we read, "When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, 'I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly.'" So 13 years have passed since the events of Genesis 16 when Abraham has a child through Hagar. That boy is called Ishmael, and after his birth, 13 years later, Yahweh appears to Abraham and identifies himself as God Almighty El Shaddai. And he tells Abraham he is to walk before him and be blameless, that Yahweh may enter into a covenant with Abraham and multiply him greatly. Now, for God to be telling Abraham he's to walk before him and be blameless, this means that Abraham has not been blameless. God says to him, you can't be acting as you have been if you are my covenant partner. Noah walked with God and was blameless, we're told in Genesis 6:9. Abram and Isaac also walked before God, Genesis 24:40 and 48:15. But here, God calls Abram not just to walk before him, but to walk before him and be blameless. Now, Noah, as we've noted earlier in the series, was blameless from the time that he was introduced into the story. With Abram, we get to share in his journey towards being blameless. The call to be blameless suggests that Abraham is not being blameless. And with Genesis 16 most immediately in the rearview mirror, we're reminded of how blameworthy Abraham's conduct has been in that episode, not to mention other earlier ones. God's covenant partnership with Abraham requires Abraham to be blameless. And so Yahweh says Abraham must be blameless in order for Yahweh to make his covenant with Abraham and to multiply him greatly. And those words, multiply you greatly, remind us of Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, where God speaks to Adam and to Noah as a part of the beginning of the creation and recreation, respectively. Then we read, Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you." We see that Abraham prostrates himself in response to God's intention to enter into a covenant with him. Now, in Genesis 15, in response to the earlier covenant promise, Abraham had complained and questioned and asked for reassurances, but here he bows in obeisance. And the comparison shows that he's mellowing and he's maturing. And God continues by saying this is a covenant that he will make with him. It's a unilateral promise. God is making the covenant. God is going to be the one that brings it to fulfillment. And that covenant is that Abraham will be the father of many nations. God changes Abraham's name, which is originally exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many, because he says, I have made you a father of many nations. And in verse 6, God promises him to make him very fruitful. Again, that reminds us of Genesis 1:28, when God speaks to humankind at the beginning that they're to be fruitful and multiply, and also Genesis 9, what God says to Noah and his sons. And God says that he's going to make nations out of him. And those nations will include eventually in the biblical story the Israelites, plus the Ishmaelites, plus the Edomites, plus the Midianites. And also, if we take this story to its complete trajectory, also many Christians of many different nations. And he says that even kings would come from him. And from the biblical record, we have Israelite and Edomite kings that can be traced to Abraham. God is making these promises, and yet, so far, the only offspring that Abraham has is Ishmael, which Abraham had to contrive from his own efforts. But God says that he will make him exceedingly fruitful, and he will multiply him greatly. Again, reminding us of Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. Now, one of the things we need to notice is that in this covenant with Abraham, God is repeating his commission to Adam at the beginning of creation. Really, when humankind was created, we're told that God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." So Adam and humankind was to fill the earth with God's glory by multiplying the image of God. In Genesis 6:1, we're told that humankind began to multiply on the earth. But in 6:5, that God saw how the wickedness of the human race had multiplied on the earth. And in 6:11, we're told that the earth was filled with violence. So the multiplying and the filling was not what God intended, but really sin and violence. So God brings a flood to decreate and recreate the earth, saving only Noah and his family. And after this decreation and recreation, God blesses Noah and gives him the same commission he gave humankind at the very beginning through Adam. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." But humankind sinned again, leading to God scattering the nations at Babel. But instead of wiping them out, God starts over with Abraham, who exists alongside sinful humanity. And we see in Genesis 12:1 that God blesses Abraham and wants to, through him, bless all humanity as he blessed Adam and Noah, with the intention that that blessing was going to go through the entire earth. Now, in Genesis 17, God not only repeats the notion of blessing Abraham, but he promises to multiply Abraham and to make him fruitful. God says he's going to do for him what he had commissioned Adam and Noah to do. But what he doesn't say is that Abraham's descendants are to fill the earth. And that's because at this point, the earth is filled with sinful humanity, as the nations have been scattered from Babel. God's plan is not to wipe that humanity out with the flood again. He promised Noah he would not do that. But God's plan is for Abram's descendants to be a blessing to all of the nations of the world by demonstrating the blessings of living according to God's instruction and by being a kingdom of priests. So yes, God says, I'm going to multiply you greatly. I'm going to make you exceedingly fruitful. But what he also says, if you look at the very last bullet point on the slide, is that he is going to infiltrate versus fill the earth. The earth is filled with sinful humanity, but what he's going to do through Abraham, he's going to infiltrate it with blessings as Israelites live in accordance with God's instruction and as they act as a kingdom of priests. In Genesis 15:5, God promises to multiply Abram's offspring like the stars in the sky. He says, gaze into the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. So will your descendants be. Well, in Galatians 3:7, Paul tells us that those who believe are the sons of Abraham. In other words, in referring to Genesis 15, Paul says that believers in Christ are the sons of Abraham, and so God will multiply Abraham's descendants, not just by physical descendants, the Jewish people, but through Christians who are sons and daughters of Abraham through their faith. And so God's intention is for the descendants of Abraham, those who believe Yahweh like Abraham did, to be multiplied in the earth like stars fill the sky and illuminate the darkness around them. As believers, we are to infiltrate the world with God's goodness like Abraham's physical descendants were to infiltrate the world around them, but failed to do so because they lost sight of God's plan and thought it was all about them. In Genesis 17, verse 7, we read, God says to Abram, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God promises to establish his covenant as an eternal covenant with Abraham's descendants, to be Abram's God and the God of his descendants. And then he promises to give Abraham the land in which he presently resided as a foreigner, as an everlasting possession to him and his descendants, and to be the God of Abraham's descendants. Well, what is new in this reiteration of the covenant? Firstly, we learn that the covenant is eternal and therefore unilaterally. It's a commitment by God to what he was going to do for Abraham and his descendants. And it was not just limited to Abraham. Secondly, the covenant is made not just with Abraham, but also with his descendants. Thirdly, the essence of the covenant is that God is going to be their God. It's like God is saying, I do, in a marriage ceremony. And four, the land has been promised to Abraham and his descendants before in Genesis 13 and 15 and Genesis 15:18, but here the land is named, and it is the land of Canaan. In verse 9, we read that God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So God tells Abraham that his part of the covenant was to keep it by undergoing circumcision and circumcising all of his male descendants as a sign of the covenant. Now, there are similarities between God's covenant with Noah and Abraham that are worth considering, as you can see on this slide. Firstly, God comes to Noah in Genesis 5:18 and promises to establish a covenant with him. Similarly, in Genesis 15:18, God enters into a covenant with Abraham. But in Genesis 9, God later reestablishes this covenant with Noah. Well, I should say he establishes it, because in 5:18 he essentially promises it, but there's a second iteration where God actually establishes it. Similarly, with Abraham, there's a second iteration where God ratifies the covenant that he has previously entered into with Abraham in Genesis 15:18. And in the case of Noah, God establishes the rainbow as the sign of his covenant with Noah. Similarly, God establishes circumcision as a sign of his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17:11. Now, this linking of Noah and Abraham creates a clear set of similarities and contrasts between the two characters and God's covenant with them. Whereas Noah was simply blameless when God started the relationship, Abram, on the other hand, has just participated in this awful sin against Hagar, resulting in the oppression of an immigrant, and so God now has to command him to be blameless. I think the biblical writer is telling us that Abraham is blameworthy, whereas Noah when God entered into the covenant with him, was blameless. As far as the sign of the covenant is concerned, the sign of the covenant for Noah and Abraham is crucial for understanding the nature and purpose of circumcision. In Genesis 9, 12, 17, and I'm borrowing these words from some class notes from Tim Mackey's Bible Project classroom, which I found very helpful in navigating the story of Abraham, and you could check that out yourself online at bibleproject.com. But Mackey writes in Genesis 9, 12 to 17, the sign of the covenant is the rainbow which shines when the rain clouds come. Rain was the instrument of divine judgment, and so the rainbow is a reminder of humanity's evil that brought the flood. But rain was also the divine response of judgment, combined with the covenant love that spared a remnant. In a similar way, in Genesis 17, 11 to 13, the sign of the covenant marks an instrument of human failure, that is Abraham's genitals. But the judgment is on the part of Abraham's body that will become fruitful for the nation. The basic idea is, as with the sign of Noah's covenant, the rainbow reflected both the judgment through rain and also the new creation that God had created by the flood. And in a similar way, circumcision speaks to the fact of Abraham's genitals being the cause of his blameworthy conduct with Hagar, but also the instrument through which God was going to bring the blessing of multiple offspring. So God judges, but God also blesses. This God is a God who uses even the circumstances of our life that bring hardship and pain and can turn them into something that is a source of blessing and fruitful use in his hands. Continuing the story, God says to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. And so God says for the first time that Sarah would be the mother of nations, and so her new name would be Sarah, not Sarai. And apparently both names mean princess. Derek Kidner writes that it appears that Sarai and Sarah are only older and newer forms of the same word, princess, but the renaming was a landmark and brought her specifically into the promise in her own right. And so God says he's going to bless Sarah and give Abram a son by her, so that she'll be the mother of nations and kings of people would come from her. God makes clear that not only Abram would be blessed, but also Sarah. That not only would Abraham have a son, but he would have one through Sarah. Not only would nations and kings come from Abraham, but they would also come to him through Sarah. This was always the plan. God only chose to reveal it now. And this shows that we need to wait on God and for his plan to unfold instead of taking things into our own hands. Well, how does Abraham respond to this latest explanation of the promise? Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? And Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Abram cannot control himself. He falls face down and laughs and says to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will my 90-year-old wife have a child? This is so laughable to him that he laughs and he says these things to himself. But what he says to God is, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. He's settling at the end of his life. He's saying, okay, I already have a son. Let's just take care of him. And let's not get ahead of ourselves by these laughable promises of me having a child now through Sarah. I'm okay. You didn't do that, God, but I'll just settle with what you've given me with Ishmael. Well, how does God respond to Abraham? God said, no, But Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. God says, no, that's not what I mean. I'm not saying that Ishmael is going to be the son that you have. What I mean, let me be absolutely clear, is that Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And Isaac means he laughs. God has a sense of humor. And God says that this son Isaac is the one with whom I will establish my everlasting covenant for his descendants. And God says, as for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So God is gracious to Abraham. He says, Isaac is the one through whom the promise will be kept. But since you already have Ishmael, I'm going to bless him also. I'm going to make him fruitful. I'm going to multiply him. I'm going to bring rulers from him. And I'm going to make him into a great nation. But Yahweh reiterates that the covenant is to be established with Isaac, the miracle child not produced by human effort, whom he says Sarah will bear within the next year. When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abram was 90 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. So God leaves without Abram saying anything further, and Abraham immediately obeys. And we're told Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So Abram obeys immediately and circumcises himself, Ishmael, and his whole household. So Genesis 17 ends with Abraham's obedient faith, signifying his commitment to his covenant relationship with God, despite the laughable promise of a physical descendant from him and Sarah at 190 years old, respectively. After all this time, Abraham is persevering in faith with this God who made him incredible promises almost 25 years ago, which seem even more incredible now. And in our next video, we will see some further growth in Abraham's relationship with God as God returns to visit with him.